Here is the first story I have in my mind vault of stories, um, called the Gravus Chronicles. And I guess this is going to be more of a lore video. So I guess from the beginning of the history to the end of this specific story. Um, so I guess we can start it off. And these aren't fully set in stone, but this is how the story is as it stands. Far into time, in the beginning, when all of existence was unified, it experienced itself all as one, under the great entity called Null. When Null was one, Null was all there was and all there is. At a certain point in time, through even sheer boredom, Null split into perfect chaos and perfect order. Within the boundaries of perfect chaos and perfect order, the thin line between two was the birth of complexity. And in this birth of complexity, this dynamism of structured chaos created the universe. Now, this has had happened over an infinite amount of times, where universes would come into and out of existence, existing in a border bubbling both the perfect order or oblivion and the perfect chaos, or called the primordial. In the primordial, energy existed in flashes. There was no uniformed path. So energy would exist and pop in, and small bits of energy would come through, while larger forms of energy would just subsume it, creating a larger mass. One day, or one time, I guess day wouldn't really work here, in a moment, two forms of energy slid through a barrier between the universe and the primordial, essentially taking on physical mattered form. These two forms of energy would soon dawn a personality, and they would end up becoming two brothers, the two first living beings. And they would exist throughout the universe. Skipping an incredibly long amount of time, we get to a billion years before current time. At that, the solar system had just formed, and a small red planet, the fourth planet from our sun, had the sort of chemical and environmental conditions for life. In this life, many different forms and fauna and flora evolved, died out, came back, and adapted. And one specific species survived through coming from seed and evolving to land, and then evolving bipedalism, and then essentially starting to form civilizations soon after its evolution. But it was around this time that something in Mars' environment changed. A solar flare knocking the magnetic poles, the sort of protection waves of magnetic waves around the planet, erased it, causing only certain pockets to have protection from intense solar radiation and intense environmental cold from space. This was close to wiping out this Martian population out, yet they survived and adapted. However, these harsh conditions changed both their biology and their society. They became more adapted to experiencing high radiation. They became more adapted to high heat and high cold. And they became more ruthless as resources became scarcer and scarcer. And over time, as their society maintained and technology evolved, they became a empire, a global empire. and dominated essentially everything around them. With a fascistic way of viewing on life, where they were at the top. Even though they had this idea of supremacy that would start to become their political ideology, they would constantly have different political upheavals where different sects of Martians would view things differently, and there would be constant civil war. This would happen so often that it would basically kind of decimate their society. Keeping their advanced technology but not having the resources to maintain it, they decided to venture elsewhere. And this starts the beginning, or the first era, of Martian conquest, where their technology was so advanced and they were basically lucky enough to be some of the first civilizations out there that they were able to conquer most of the galaxy within like 1 or 2 million years. And with this, they processed and produced their ideology everywhere, having Martians be at the top of any social hierarchy around the planet, and the native of those planets being reduced to mere slaves, farming resources to maintain those societies. One such group was a society of, you would say, beings of Herculean stature. They were tall, had different skin tones. Some glowed gold, some silver, some bronze. They were a race of super scientists. And one thing was that they were very peaceful. Due to their specific evolutionary biology, they had what was a reactor at the core of their body, or somewhere in the core of their body, such that if it was to be damaged, or if they were to consciously abrupt it, it could destroy the planet. This mutual assured destruction essentially forced the entire population to essentially never resort to violence in any situation, and always try to keep peace, given that if something went too far, it could be the end of their entire race. So by the time they met the Martians, while their physical bodies were such to where they rarely took damage, rarely aged, could fly and have super strength, they just weren't equipped for fighting. While the Martians, who were resistant to things like extreme freezing colds, almost absolute zero, extreme heat, and radiation, their bodies, because of evolving to Mars, could not handle hard gravity, and they would be essentially weak to blunt force trauma. So this caused a specific battle between these races and the Martians. Eventually, the Martians taking over, winning, and maintaining dominance for hundreds of thousands of years. Within this was eventually, over time, the Martian Empire hit into that decay, something happened. Something very weird happened. Somehow, without knowing, planets across the galaxy who have never had contact with each other overall, at one point in time, rose up against the Martians, and collectively, on a galaxy-wide scale, pushed them back. The overwhelming force, and the Martians' government spread thin. There was no way they were able to take it all, and eventually had to leave those places. Most of the fighting was so bad that most of those planets ended up dying because of the fallout of the war. One subplanet being the specific planet of the sort of Titan beings. They decided that instead of living their lives in slavery and servitude, that they would just merely all destroy the planet in order to stop the Martians' exploitation. Though one father decided to save his son as a totem of their race's history and culture, hoping that he could survive on where their line would end here. And this baby was then sent through a wormhole, drifting them throughout time and space to some unknown desiccation. This inward fighting had happened for at least 1,000 years, driving the Martians back, and eventually every Martian had left that planet to go back to their home planet. But coming back is to find out that the Martian planet had degraded more since the time most of them had left. The society had gone through more decay. Most of the plants and the animals had started to die off, it was looking like Mars was also going to be one of those dead planets. At this time, there was an idea of going to another planet one more time, a planet closer to there, the third planet from the sun. And they tried it. It was about a couple 100 million years before present time. And then they decided to get up their resources to go to this planet. They go to this planet and they find the atmosphere is, while not suitable, they had to be in their suits because the atmosphere just was too thick for them to maintain. It still was something that they could try to colonize, though they were not used to the sort of megafauna that existed. Beasts that were towering above them with feathers and reptilian skin. It was just something they weren't used to. Yet the technology was such to where they could easily run them over, and the native population just had no real technology or real fighting force of society. These were, in their minds, primitive creatures who merely used their bodies as a way to exist throughout time. Except for one. Something sort of innate within the planet. A almost defense mechanism for invaders. This is the first and last time they've ever seen it. But a giant, enormous reptilian who had capacity for nuclear energy hidden strongly within its body had risen up as a result of the Martian colonization. Their battles with this monster had proven unsuccessful, and they feared that their colonies would essentially die out if they continued to fight with this singular creature. Something that they would dub a god. So they ended up packing and heading back to Mars. Their last mission of trying to find a planet suitable to maintain just not working out. But before they went, they did cause a extinction-wide event, wiping out most of the population on planet Earth. And that was the end of the Martian Empire era. The second era would begin about 40 years before that time. But before then, we're gonna cut a little side through. So back in 1860, on a southern plantation in Louisiana was a small, was a kind of a big blast of light that would come down and sort of like shock like all the people on the farm, shock the slaves, shock the slave owners, and essentially they would come out to see a small little pod, and within this pod was a glowing pale baby that resembled a person. Now, seeing this and seeing that have transpired, there was this belief that this baby was sent by God, was ordained, was blessed, was maybe even an angel. And as such, the farmer essentially adopted the baby and had the baby live inside the house while, maintaining their slave plantation. By the time this baby was 3, the baby would hang out and play around and have times, and especially make good friends with the slave children. It so happened that one day, the baby that was playing with this small slave child had witnessed the small slave child be smacked across its face by the slave owner's wife. In an instant, without really thinking, the 3-year-old lifted up a drawer dresser, flinging it at the slave owner's wife, killing her on impact. This broke out and shocked most of the residents there, unable to figure out how exactly this happened and how a baby was able to do this. It got around that maybe the baby was demonic, was evil. And essentially they formed a way to execute the baby by lynching. What they noticed, though, is that when they tried to, there would be no way for the baby to be hung because the baby would float in the air. This would cause great fear amongst the plantation owners, and they merely drove the baby out. And this would happen where this baby, as it grew older and he became a small child and even a teenager, he would go from plantation to plantation, at first trying to hide his abilities, but then as seeing the brutality, react and being kicked off of each farm. Eventually, by himself, living alone in specific wooded areas, he would run across a strange fellow, a fellow named Tom. And somehow, in some way, this fellow knew about his abilities and was able to help him master and take control of them. And with this, he learned how to control his flight to go into high speeds. He learned how to use his strength so precisely, and learned a very specific, exciting style to use that strength. And eventually they parted ways when he reached into his 20s. Around this time, he had found out about the Civil War that was happening, and essentially enlisted in the North. From this point on, and from every world war up until World War II, he would travel the world, fighting in wars, trying to understand and use his abilities for good. But he would come to a specific understanding that there was a way in which the world worked, where certain people were on top while the many others suffered. And this had changed him, especially when he saw how the outcomes of wars and the lives lost and all the violence never seemed to change this fundamental way in which societies worked. Now, unbeknownst to everyone else, he had lived several hundred years, from 1860s all the way down to the 1950s, all while looking into his mid-30s. But regardless, he maintained a specific identity. Eventually, after the 1940s, he decided that for his sake and for the sake of others, that he would create a group. At this point, he was one of a bunch of different people that were considered anomalous in nature, and were given the name Exos, or extraordinary beings. And they were essentially seen as the other. They were pushed out from society. They were on the edges, and anytime they would come into contact with law enforcement or the general population, it would just end up in bad form. There was nothing ways to really protect them from the sort of violence that they would experience from society or institutions. So this person, who would then name himself Harvey Wood, would find to try to do something about it. He ended up trying to organize a group of different exos, or extraordinary beings, to start to change public perception about exos overall. He created essentially a task force of folks with different abilities that would then go out and essentially show to the people that, like, the ideas and the stereotypes about them weren't true. They would, in emergency situations, they would be there to help out. In environmental disasters, they would be the first ones on the line. And over time, their good nature and their ability to help when all of the resources were thin made them endeared to the public. And this endearing allowed them to gain part of political power and even political seats. Now, this eventually allowed them to work with other groups, other civil rights groups, other labor groups, to try and again gain a coalition of rights for different marginalized groups. Now, something changed around that society. It was the late 50s, early 60s, and the Exos had been enjoying a good new amount of rights, visibility within the public, and being able to be within modern society without being seen or being able to having to hide the sort of true nature of their abilities. Now, certain corporations and companies saw the sort of utility of the abilities and felt that they could use them for their own interests, specifically interest overseas, where they needed to squash rebellions and maintain monopoly. So they petitioned Harvey, trying to tell him how greater his gains would be if he would basically commit to them a task force of exos that would essentially be a paramilitary group. Now, Harvey's both understanding the horrors of war, as well as the sort of the specific material distinction that was going on over there, he flat out denied, stating the rule of this organization is that they were not a police group, nor were they a military group. With this, he felt that he rested his case, but those in power didn't really like that answer. What would happen from the at least 59 until about 62 was a heavy bombardment ad campaign where, through the use of media apparatuses, exos would be malaligned with by the media, showing that they were violent in nature, that they were secretive, that they were colluding, that they couldn't be trusted. And eventually certain things would break out in the public, certain violent actions would break out, and specific political officials were being bribed and persuaded in order to put in specific laws that would then embolden the crimes and the sort of violence against them, and essentially destroy the sort of public image. And they made a way to make sure that Harvey couldn't stop them. And see, at the time, Harvey had married and had a wife and child. And in a mysterious accident where no one knows what happened, an arson happened at his house, killing both his wife and child, and causing him great trauma he's probably never felt in his life. From this trauma, his body changed. He let out a large burst of energy, and his body resumed the form that he did back as a teenager. What also happened was a loss of all of his memories. You'd wake up one day on the street not knowing who he was or why he was here. And with Harvey taken out as the leader, and a lot of the gains gained being lost through propaganda, most of the exos that were made to political power who had official office were voted out, and most of the laws that allowed protection for exos were repealed and removed. Moreover, it became a federal ban on any person deemed to have what we essentially calls a improper use of extraordinary abilities, essentially making a ban on exos existing and pushing them back into the margins for the rest of time into modern history. This brings us to the late 60s, early 70s. Zooming out a bit, back to Mars, we see that Mars is essentially a dying society. They're on their last leg, and they only exist in pockets of maybe a few, several dozen, waiting out to the end of their society. In this were a collection of 6 scientists who still held out hope that they could survive and maybe rebuild somewhere else, but a different society, a society not based off domination, but of mutual care. However, the one problem was that Martians were still weak to other atmospheres. They had monitored certain places and saw that Earth was somehow still suitable and probably safe for them to go, though they were still unaware as to why they hadn't tried it a millennia ago, unaware of the previous attempt to colonize Earth. However, be that as it may, they decided to travel down to Earth and try to maintain a life there. However, they came across a problem. It was Earth's atmosphere. And they had no technology anymore in order to maintain life on there. But they did have another way. They were working on a bioengineered life form that was able to take a role of an artificial intelligence. With constant tinkering and maintaining of a biosynthetic creation, they were able to come upon this entity. And this entity would then allow them to be able to maintain their body while existing in different atmospheres. It was something that allowed them to maintain and manipulate their molecules and a molecular structure in order to essentially survive in almost any atmosphere, in almost any place. One of the drawbacks, though, was that they would lose their weakness, their vulnerability to extreme heat, radiation, and extreme cold. Though, in their mind, this was a sacrifice meant to make to save their race. However, even though they had finally come across a solution and felt that even in the final hour, there was a slim gray of hope, other groups that still existed did not have that same their share of views. And one particular faction of extinctionists felt that this was punishment from the universe for Martian crimes, and that they should all just take their bow as a species. But instead of merely killing themselves, they did specific terrorism throughout the specific areas, causing mass chaos in the small little pockets there are. And they had been watching these groups of scientists for a bit. What had happened, essentially, was a bomb blowing up the scientific lab, killing 4 of the 6 scientists working, last leaving only 2 brothers alive with the technology still in hand. In a bum rush, they tried to make it to a specific pod that they could leave the planet with, hoping that they could get away in time, trying to survive. Unfortunately, the airship was damaged before they had a chance of doing it, probably done by the faction. Somehow, though, they were able to make it from Mars to Earth, holding on to basically holding on to hope, while the aircraft not really being able to maintain that distance for more than longer. Specifically, the landing capabilities having been destroyed, and meaning that they would probably crash land and die, being the end of the Martian race. Except one of the brothers had a this idea. He bonded with the biosynthetic symbiote and used his molecule manipulation abilities to shield the landing for his other brother at the cost of himself and the ship. They crash landed somewhere off the coast of Mexico, and the brother, trying to honor his brother's sacrifice, takes on the symbiote from him and tries to move up north towards the United States. And this brings us to the main story. In the 70s, two sisters exist in the northern part of the United States. One of the sisters having 2 children, a 10-year-old named Marvin and a young baby that yet unnamed. Visiting, she finds out that her sister is married to a person she had never really seen before, who went under the moniker of John Smith. In this meeting, Marvin wanted to go playing and carrying his baby sibling on his back, ends up finding a specific area, a small little lab. He opens it, seeing all these cool tech and these cylinders and these and beakers. He ended up trying to have some fun playing around. He ended up picking up one that had a small blue, what seemed like creature, but didn't look like anything from planet Earth. Having his fun, he eventually tripped on a plug, dropping both the container with the creature in it and falling on it. Because it was in a solution, this caused him to essentially become electrocuted by the outlet, where both him and his sister extreme high volts of electricity. Now, in this freak accident, the symbiote was also electrocuted, and given this a little bit high levels of energy, it was able to use this to bond with him and his DNA. While the younger sibling merely experienced and became a high conductor of electricity. Hearing the freak accident, the mother comes down rushing and seeing a very terrible sight. her small child liquefying and more trying to hold himself together in a panic state, and her baby glowing a bright bluish glow. Where the and this is where this truth came out, that the husband was the Martian that landed several years prior and merely assumed the identity of a black man in America. With this, though, he was able to create a solution bath that was able to save Marvin, and eventually have him stabilized. While they essentially found the secret, and the sisters agreed to keep the secret safe, so that way he would not essentially be targeted by authorities for essentially being the first alien they've ever met. And in a sense of gratitude, the alien named dubbed John would then help Marvin control his abilities and be able to keep himself in a stabilized situation for the most part, essentially becoming a father figure to Marvin for a while. In a couple years down the road, Marvin and his younger sibling ended up having to live with John and his wife for the rest of the time they grew up, given that the younger sibling, as a baby, electrocuted their mother, and her mother died to death. I don't know why I said that. With this, they went throughout life, and Marvin and then the dubbed Marsha had to essentially move around while not being caught for their abilities, which was easier for Marvin as he had got a better control of his abilities, but was harder for Marsha, as while she never got the symbiote, she would have a problem where in deep emotional issues, she would tend to burst lights and would always have metal objects that stick to her hair. Eventually, these two would grow up, gaining a better hold on their abilities and their powers, and would then make it into adulthood, living on their own. Marvin, understanding seeing how he went through, how he had to hide who he was, understanding other exos and the life they lived, knowing that, like, essentially knowing what it was like to, like, live as in the shadows, decided that something in society needed to change, and he felt he had the answer. He felt that if he could change society's perception and give them a look about how exos were, that he could somehow change the discrimination he faced. So in his efforts, he would try to essentially help the public and keep the public safe. At times, he would be a hired gun. Other times, he would stop who would be the kind of seen as the first supervillains, and make a name for himself. He also learned a specific technique some time ago in his 20s, where he was able to extend his body further than its usual length, and he was dubbed the name Extendo. For 10 years, he would go and considerably fail at trying to show the public the essentially good sides of exos. He even teamed up with a young teenager named Harvey. Unbeknownst to him, Harvey's past of trying to do the same thing 20 years and 30 years earlier. Eventually, through trials and errors, and the teaming up of Harvey and Marvin, Harvey trying to help Marvin in his goals, and Marvin promising to help Harvey get his memories back. They make a name for themselves. They get into a lot of trouble with the federal government, becoming on several watch lists. And on the way, Marvin meets his then girlfriend and modern time wife, Sandra. Towards the end of the 90s, after Harvey had reclaimed his memories and come back to his adult form, Marvin, looking back on his life, felt as if he didn't really accomplish what he set out, and sort of reclined himself to maybe giving up. Though in his heart he felt that maybe there was another chance. Though this would change when he found out that Sandra was pregnant. And by the end of 99, Sandra would have given birth to their daughter, Ashanti. With this, Marvin would, looking at life from this specific angle as a father, resign himself to giving up the idea of creating a hero of society, and merely went into a regular life where his identity, his secret identity, would be no longer, and it would just become his identity, taking on the idea of a common self businessman, and trying to eke out a living for his wife and his daughter. Also with this, the people and friends he's made along the way had also made an agreement to essentially live their lives separately and go on to do things by essentially for themselves. Something also changed. By the time of Ashanti's birth, Marvin noticed his body was not as it used to be. And he also noticed that he would get weaker and sicker as the time went on, having less strength, having less stamina, and eventually getting to the point to where he would start to cough up blood. And this cough would travel him up until Ashanti's 18th birthday. Okay, that was the lore. And that ends the second phase and the second era. Now, here is the complete story of the Gravus Chronicles from the beginning of the first chapter all the way to the ending. So, in the story, Ashanti is just an 18-year-old, and she has big ideas. This also was the first time in 67 years where the federal government had decriminalized essentially being an exo. So while certain states may have restrictions and limitations, there would not be a federal ban on using your abilities or being seen with your abilities. Now, this had happened in 2016. And while this was a major change, most of the public perception around exos had been cemented, and most were seen as untrustworthy and dangerous, and therefore kept to themselves and tried their best to hide their abilities. With this, Ashanti had a dream of maybe changing society's mind, creating what she would be later learn from her teacher Harvey Milk as the heroes of old, maybe making a new group of superheroes that could gain the trust of society. Towards the end of her high school career, when she had graduated, her and her father got into a dispute where she wanted to become a hero, and her father essentially disagreed with her, telling her she should go to college and sort of live a normal life. With this argument, they ended up not talking to each other for a few days, and what eventually would happen is that Marvin would go missing, which was extremely unusual, given that he's never someone who would be more than a day out of work, or more than just like a late night at the office. With this, Ashanti had set out to